You are listening to Creativity in Healthcare, hosted by Dr. Matthew J. Taylor, editor of the textbook Fostering Creativity in Rehabilitation. In this podcast, we explore creativity as it relates to how you can foster your own creativity and that of your related healthcare organizations. Healthcare reform hasn't happened yet, but working together, let's explore how we can nurture the next new growth in healthcare delivery.
Welcome to Creativity in Healthcare. I'm Matt Taylor, your host, and today's show 4 of our podcast series, and I'm excited to have my best friend actually be our subject today, and that's Staffan Elgelid, Dr. Staffan Elgelid. Staffan and I have known each other for 14 years, and they've been 14 good years, and I'm really excited because today we're going to talk about the systems limitations within both academia and the professional associations and how that impacts creativity in healthcare. Staffan has an amazing background. He was born in Östersund, Sweden, grew up there, then came over to the States to get his physical therapy degree, has worked with world champion athletes. He was quite the marathon runner in Sweden, and he had his own private practice for a time, eventually decided he wanted to explore some other avenues. He went through the entire Feldenkrais series of development, which was a 4-year certification program. So now he's a guild certified Feldenkrais practitioner as well as a licensed physical therapist. Later went back and got his master's and his PhD, has been teaching at a number of different doctoral programs in physical therapy, and presently is teaching at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. And so in addition to that, though, Staffan has written extensively. He's more recently finished an extensive yoga therapy training process that complemented his other works. He might talk about that a bit in the interview. But basically, he's seen both the European and the United States programs for academia and development professional systems that, as he'll explain, might create some limitations for us. And so that's what we're going to look at today. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is he contributed 2 chapters to my textbook, Creativity, Fostering Creativity in Rehabilitation. And in his chapter on this very topic, he began with a quote from his favorite band, his favorite musician and creative artist, and that would, of course, be none other than the boss, Bruce Springsteen. And so what I thought we'd do is we'll intro the show with the quote that he used, and this is how the quote goes. It's from the song No Surrender by Bruce Springsteen. And then the song begins with, "We busted out of class, had to get away from those fools. We learned more from a 3-minute record than we ever learned in school." So let's go learn something with my dear friend and colleague, master of many things, and particularly he loves the how, not the why. So here comes Staffan, and first, cue up the boss. Here we are. You got it, and that's the boss bringing us in. So I got to ask you, Staffan, I introduced you ahead of time here, and what we did was we just played Bruce's lick there from No Surrender, we busted out of class, had to get away from those fools. We learned more from a 3-minute record than we ever learned in school. Some people might take that as a slam against academia and everything else, but give us an idea of why you would begin a chapter with that kind of a citation rather than some rigorous scholarly thing, or what is it that sparked in you?
Well, basically, I'm a big Springsteen fan. That's what really sparked it. But I think academia tends to be, especially for the rehab professionals, we tend to be very theoretical. Uh-huh. And having been in the clinic myself for a good, 13, 14 years before I entered academia. I teach from patient experience, from the knowledge I got from the patients, and I think that's where the value lies. However, in academia, that is not valued as much as having a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I have in physical therapy, I have worked with some PhDs that have never really touched patients outside of their internships. They never had a desire. They never had the thought. They wanted to do research, and I think there's a practical knowledge, and I think as a whole we're down valuing practical knowledge in academia and in society at large to some extent.
What do you mean by practical? What?
Hands-on knowledge, learning through your hands.
Movement by chance, since we're both physical therapists?
Movement by chance, yes. There was resistance when in the health and wellness class, I decided that we need to do at least half an hour of movement instead of 2 hours and 20 minutes of lecture twice a day. There was resistance, and I actually even had a faculty member say that if I was in your class, I would refuse to move. I would refuse to do any of these things.
Oh, wow.
So there is a huge value on theory, but not as much on the practical aspect.
And do you see that spill over in the other healthcare professions too? I think you mentioned in your chapter about, dietitians don't eat much.
Well, I think the focus is on patient care and not on self-care. It's the do as I say, not as I do.
Oh.
To a large extent, and that is what we value. And to some extent, it's a system where we are locked into those values. Now, I look at academia as a whole, and if I teach a theory class, a lecture class, for every hour that I teach a week, I get 1 credit. But if I teach a hands-on class, a laboratory class, a practical class, I need to teach 2 or 3 hours to get a 1 credit. So it's built into the system that hands-on practical work is not as valuable as theory, even in the hands-on professions, such as physical therapy, such as nursing, or anything else. So we devalue it, and we are really telling the students that it's not as valuable.
Yeah,
usually the tests are a higher percentage of the grade than the theoretical test than the practical test.
And the practical, yeah. And so in the chapter, you did a great job of kind of giving the reader an orientation of how this might have come up. Kind of the development of academia through time, and versus the vocations where you were out being a craftsman or you were out doing a skill. You talked about that in some detail.
Yeah, to some extent, and if we look back at academia, a large percentage of schools way back when were religious, and part of their whole idea was to develop the person, to develop morals and so forth, which is something that we really dropped now. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore,
right?
In my opinion. But that also limited the creativity, because in a lot of the schools you had to follow a certain dogma. You had to follow the religious dogma, and if you went outside of that, that was not really popular. Then, of course, in the 1800s and so, the vocational schools became big, where you actually then produced someone who had a profession. Now, the healing professions were usually gone from in families, from parents, from grandparents, and so forth. So you really grew up with the healing professions. It was a calling for you. And ever since you were young, you were part of it, and you kind of absorbed it. You have the guilds, the guild systems.
And you learn by doing rather than sitting.
Exactly. You learn by doing. But of course, we look down upon the guilds, and we look down upon the vocational schools. And we held the theory to a higher standard, or to higher. We held it in higher. We looked upon it in a higher level.
Right.
And I know when I went to school in Sweden, it was always, we only have 9 years of mandatory school, and then we have, most people go another 2 or 3 years. But we always look down upon the kids that spent the next couple of years to become welders or painters or electricians or something
Sure,
like that.
that's the same over here, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
well, that's
exactly.
the other bus. You know, that's
Yeah, that's the other bus. Yeah,
right.
good point. That's the other bus.
Yeah, they take off for the vocational school, and
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So, but then physical therapy, for example, to get into the university, to get into the academe, we had to then follow the rules of academia to a large extent.
hmm
And that devalued the hands-on work in many
yeah,
respects.
and you mentioned with, you know, like, say, the development of the AMA and the Flexner report, and that where we kind of put constraints on what would be considered as legitimate
Yeah,
healthcare, and that, right? And and then as the other ancillary professions come in, they've kind of found themselves in that same constraint, which puts bumpers on what can be looked at, what can be considered as legitimate.
yeah, yeah. No, the Flexner report did a lot of good things. I mean, it standardized medical care to a large extent, and there was some really crazy stuff going on, but it also limited, I mean, it limited minorities, it limited women, uh, and it limited a lot of the alternative approaches uh, to medicine. But medicine was and still is the pinnacle of healthcare. People tend to think, you know, the physician. We have a hierarchy in healthcare. So of course, the other professions, then, I mean, physical therapy, we were accredited by the medical profession. You know, they were in charge of our education.
And
So
they ran our departments too.
they ran our departments too, yeah,
Right.
and not only physical therapy, but most of the rehab professions.
Right.
So for us then to try to get to that level, we try to model medical education,
Mhm.
and you know, good and bad. I mean, again, I mean, we're doing some great stuff. We're doing some fabulous research and so forth, but there are side effects to it too.
Sure. Yeah, and in your article, you outlined kind of those points of what happens in the application process, what happens in the student success you know, if you're going to be a successful student, what do you have to do? And largely, you know, if you want to kind of touch on those trends, again, it's not we're not bashing the system, but we're saying what the constraints are within the system that are going to limit creativity at this point. And so you say, you know, between the students having to have the grades, which meant they have to, you know, if you kind of talk about that a second, about that kind of the succession. And
Yeah, I mean, if I look at the students, and right now I'm actually going through applications for next summer for our next cohort, and we have 450 applications. We're a freshman at mid school, so we'll probably not accept more than maybe 10 out of those 450. And we have a scale, and that we score them on, and reality is the GPA, science GPA and overall GPA are the most objective things to look at.
For predicting what, though?
Well, the science GPA is the best predictor that we have if you're going to pass the boards.
Okay.
Which is
and that's not a hands-on movement-related test.
It used to be, but that was a little bit too subjective, I guess, and time-consuming. So now it's just a multiple choice test.
Yeah.
But it's hard. You know, we give some extra points for work experience, for volunteer experience, and then we have an unclassified category where we can give a couple of extra points. But the main weight out of a 15-point scale, 10 points is still GPA.
Okay.
So it's because it's there, it's objective, it's quick to look at instead of sitting down and reading through lots of essays. You know, it's right there, and some schools go basically only on GPA. So what does the GPA say? The GPA says that you're good at imitating, you're good at spitting back the information, you're good at the predictable stuff, but you know, like you talk about and what's in the book is that now we're dealing with uncertainty and not with the predictable stuff anymore, because we're moving into a post-normal world. And if we look at our patients, now we're dealing with chronic disease.
Right.
We're dealing with lifestyle issues. We're not dealing with, you know, you have A and therefore B will make you better. It doesn't work like that anymore. So we need these creative students, but a creative student will probably not get straight A's.
Right.
Because their mind works a little bit different. I brought up in the book how when I first started teaching, my idea was that if we have a lab practical, I'll give you,
Yeah.
90 or 95%, but the last 5%, you've got to take a chance, do something creative, and I'll give it to you whether you can pull it off or not.
Right.
And within 30 minutes, they were up complaining to the other faculty members that I can't do that. If I do everything right and if I imitate everything you taught me, I should get 100%. And I had to scrap the whole idea.
Yeah.
And that's what it still is. It's about imitation. It's about reproducing what you have been taught.
Right. Yeah, and that's Alfonso Montori, who was in the first couple interviews of this podcast, and he terms that reproductive education, right? You just reproduce what was dished out, and therefore your success. But then when we look, like you say, with these chronic complex conditions that all of us across all the healthcare professions are having to look at, it's not just your AC1. It's not just your, there's so many factors that we have to be able to juggle. And so once the student gets in, they get through the hurdle of the GPA, and now they're in class. And like you say, the resistance to the 5% creative expression that way. But what else do you, when they're in class and they start to go into like a practical situation, what kind of behaviors do you see that restrict their creativity when they're sitting with their first client, and that how is that constrained based on that?
It's kind of interesting because our students in their first year, they actually take care of people for their health and wellness needs.
Okay.
And I actually see a fair amount of creativity in the first year, because they haven't been taught all the right stuff.
Okay.
But the further along they get, the majority of them becomes more and more standardized.
Mm-hmm.
They become more and more alike, partly, and we have on-site clinics here that are run by faculty for the students. And I think they do some to please the faculty, because this is what I've been taught, and this is probably what they want to see. But I do think to some extent the creativity is going down. I mean, we all ooh and ah if we see a student that take a chance and do something, or most of us ooh and ah, not everyone. But there is a point where, we also grade them on certain things, that they can do certain procedures and so forth.
Yeah, so there's kind of that tension between the rigor of kind of safety and appropriateness, and but at the same time, they don't have a book to open up and look and see, how do I deal with this 61-year-old diabetic amputee smoker with Parkinson's, right? That doesn't exist in the literature, so to speak.
Yeah. And if I take a lot of time to have them deal with that amputee smoker diabetic 61-year-old, which is interesting, that's not going to be on the board.
No.
And I got to ensure that the students pass the board exam too.
Right.
So even faculty that do want to go more outside and do interesting things, to some extent, are limited in that there's certain content, and most of the content is directed. I mean, to some extent, I'm lucky in that I get to teach health and wellness to the students, which is not yet as directed, although they are moving in that direction too.
For that part.
But if it's on the board, we got to make sure that they pass the board. So we are limited time-wise, because there's only so much time we have the students, and there are certain procedures that they have to learn. There are certain theories that they have to learn, and
right. And you did a good job of illustrating then the constraints that the board process has, right? It's our various healthcare boards are chaired and served by the experts who are teaching what they teach, right?
Yeah.
And so, it just keeps winnowing in like that, and all of a sudden, where is and some people, I guess, would argue that, well, in the student phase, there really shouldn't be the creativity. It's kind of getting your chops, doing your scales, doing those sorts of things. But it seems like, as fast as healthcare is changing right now for all of the professions, whatever we're learning taught by people that, like you said, quite often haven't been in the clinic for years or ever, there's going to be a big gap, isn't there, between the students coming out and then what they meet in reality, as far as having 20 minutes with the patient to do all their things. It's
and we talk about the board and who writes the questions. Yeah, it's the experts. Probably 60% of them, those are the latest numbers I saw, are faculty members, and faculty members then are successful in the system that they were brought up in, and they are experts in what they teach.
right.
But they're not in the clinic. And so much, I hear it all the time that, yeah, well, this therapist did really well with that, but that's really anecdotal, which means it really doesn't have any value.
Right. It might not even happen.
Yeah, and the board questions have to come out of the most common textbooks. They're probably running at least 2 or 3 years behind research. So if there's any new research, that can't be on the board exam. So while we bring that in to class, maybe we can't put too much emphasis on it either, because it might go against what's on the board exam.
I see.
It's because that comes straight out of the textbooks.
Sure. And you mentioned the research. You had some interesting insights into how the various factors on research between, the doctoral student matching up with whoever their chair is and the funding process and that. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how
I can bring up my own experience, and I got really lucky. I entered a PhD program that had just started, and they knew me quite well there, and the chair was pretty open and said, this might be the only PhD program you can ever complete, because we're new and you can do whatever you want to, basically. But reality is, most programs, you'll have a lot of people applying. The professors will then look at and say, well, I'm interested in this student or that student, and they match them up. But the professor also needs to publish. So they will pick something that they know a lot about, naturally, and that they're already doing research on. So if you come in with a really, really creative idea that is way out there, way cool, it'll be hard to find a professor that says, well, this aligns with my research activity, or this is something that we can get an NIH grant for, because it's so creative and it's so outside the norm. So, and it's the same if you apply for a grant and it's way outside the norms. Who decides if you're going to get a grant or not? The experts in the field that are already sitting out on the branch of the tree pretty far out on their own research, and they say, oh, this might threaten my own research, or I don't recognize this.
Yeah.
So it's a system that has so many branches and so many tentacles, and they all interact, from how we select the students, to how we select the faculty, to how we select who gets to publish, to how we select who gets to get the grants and get to be the PhDs and all that stuff. Even to get tenure as a PhD, you have a group of peers that have already gotten it because they did the traditional thing.
Oh wow, the dog chasing.
It's all interweaving into each other, and that makes it difficult to change the whole system. It's kind of healthcare, you and I talked about it. We put little band-aids on it all the time, but it's almost like we have to start from scratch.
Yeah, because if we're really going to reform, by definition, it's not a little shift here and a little shift here. It's looking back at that. Yeah. And you did such a great job in the chapter outlining then how those tentacles, as you say, go right into our professional associations. The same people are chairing committees, running specialty sections, specialty boards, right? So, absolutely. So we just keep perpetuating those constraints.
Yeah. So, and at this point, this fall, we're actually writing up, every 10 years we have to be accredited. And this fall, we're writing up our accreditation documents. And they are also very strict. And one of the big things is to report graduation rates, and pass rates on the board. And it's the same thing there. If we decide, to some extent, it's decided you need to have this many sciences and so forth to get into a program. Mm-hmm. But if we decide, we would like more artists, We would like people with an arts background. Well, if that means that for the first few years our board rate goes down or more students drop out of the professional phase, then our accreditation will kind of nail us on that. So it's not going to be encouraged. And also people looking at the program will say, well, they don't have the pass rates on the board, even though we might be at 80% compared to the average, which is like 94. And out of our 80%, 50% are doing some really, really groovy things.
Right.
But that doesn't really matter. It's the overall board rate. And of course, the school then is looking at retention rates. And they say, well, if you start dropping students, then we don't get the tuition dollars.
Right.
So even that is, those tentacles are intertwined with everything else too.
Certainly. Yeah. So out of this constraint and crisis, what's our opportunity? What can we?
Our opportunity is basically that you and I take over the whole educational system all over the world.
Oh, I like that.
I like that. Well, I like that too, although we will be pretty busy and no naps for us.
Exactly. And
but I think there is opportunity, and I will also say that almost every year I get one or two students, one more likely than two, that come in with some interesting background. And since I'm reading through all the different applications for this school, I look for people that have second careers, and I can usually get one or two that are borderline, that have an interesting second career that we feel will balance out the class and will bring something unique to the program.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, I've seen some fabulous former students do interesting things, such as Jamie down in Tucson.
Right.
I've had some other students that come in with a yoga background, for example, or some other interesting background, martial arts, and military, other second careers.
Right.
And while they're struggling in the program, because a lot of times they don't feel like their background is acknowledged, because and this, I think this is especially for yoga, since both you and I are into yoga and it becomes real popular. I've had students with yoga background really being disturbed because they're not encouraged or allowed to really do much from their yoga background while they're in the on-site clinics, because we want to see other things.
Well,
And they feel like they're really being devalued. And I tell them, I say, while you're in here, to some extent, forget about what you're doing in the yoga world. Just reproduce, because what's important is that you get your degree, you get your license, and then go out and do the really cool things.
Do the expressive stuff.
No different than, absolutely. And they are doing some interesting things. So I think we see slow infiltration into the communities, but it's very, very slow. And it's how do we keep encouraging these students with different backgrounds to do it and to support them and not crush them while they're in school, because some of them are being crushed.
Right. And yesterday I had an interesting experience that kind of gave me some hope too. And that is, I was invited to do a lunchtime presentation down at ASU, Arizona State University. Dr. Jennifer Huberty invited me, and she's in the ASU Health and Fitness Department. And she also invited in an old colleague of mine, Dr. Linda Larkey, who just got a over $2 million grant to study Tai Chi. And she brought along several of her senior students and a bunch of students. And we had over 30 people in the room, several physicians. And what happened was I got to talk about what yoga therapeutics was from a shared language. So it wasn't just doing asana and measuring therapeutic exercise influence, but we talked about the whole spectrum of that. And there was a big enthusiasm within the room, lots of questions, and we could look at this and we could do that. So it's almost like we can circle in and around through different avenues and break out of our binders of having to stay in our silo, right? And the drive then, because they acknowledge the neuroplastics, all this science that's not necessarily in our silo, right? And so if we encourage listeners to maybe look a little broader, with a broader lens of who can you affiliate with to make these things come forward, that might be one way of.
I think that's a great way of doing it. And I'm also telling my students that, read outside of the physical therapy journals, read outside of your field, because creativity is bringing in something into what you already know and make something new out of it. And if all you read are the PT or the rehab journals, you're not really bringing in anything new. You're just reinforcing what you already believe, and we all like to do that, whether it's in politics or religion or whatever. We like to reinforce sources so that we become more sure about what we already know.
Right.
Which is kind of a crazy idea, but that doesn't lead to creativity.
No.
And I talked a lot about social connectedness. Talked a lot about the spiritual aspect in health and wellness. We talked about the emotional aspects. So we need to start looking at that, because really that's where a lot of the research is going today. It's not about necessarily the purely technical aspect anymore.
Right.
But we know that, especially, and again, we come back to people have lifestyle issues today, and we have to deal with it. And I believe that we will get there. And I believe that what we do at the university level is phenomenal, in that we give them a very solid background in anatomy, in the physiology, in the neuro, and so forth. Right. And I think we can set up a very, very nice framework for them. I'm all about setting up frameworks. I like the framework idea.
Right.
But I believe in an open framework. And I believe, because there are certain basic concepts that the students have to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I see the students coming out of the universities compared to a lot of the students that come out of non-university trainings, that they're more grounded, they're more solid in that. However, we tend to close the framework a little bit too much for them. And we need to make them understand that, here's a starting point. Now develop your own style. Moshe Feldenkrais used to say that, you develop your own handwriting. It's the basic, develop your own handwriting. We should all do things a little bit different depending on who we are. Right. And while I see the non-academic trainings have a lot of openness, they don't have a framework in the same way.
Exactly.
So where's the balance between having an open framework, having no framework, and having a framework that is too closed?
Right.
Yeah. And we need to find the balance somewhere in there.
Yeah. And I think that maybe for our listeners, a good example out of our experience is what we've seen happen with that closed Facebook group of rehab professionals that are yoga oriented. So it's grown from 12 people to we're right at 640, I think now. And where we're exchanging, so with technology, that's another way we can find our community, what we're passionate about, and then begin to share ideas and share literature, so that we have that framework, and then the group in dialogue tests that framework, looks for the holes and the openings and what we call the bridging, right? So So if people want to connect with you in the future, if they want to invite you to explore this topic further or whatever, is there a way to get a hold of you?
No. I live in a closed framework.
You're an academician. You're in your ivory tower, right?
Yeah, exactly. We don't like outsiders to come in here.
No, I don't blame you.
They can reach me at my email address.
Okay, and that is?
Staffan, Staffan, at somatologique.com.
Somatologique. That's okay, and we'll put that up on the video and in the show notes as well.
And I'd love to have people contact me, because I learned so much from people that are contacting me.
Yeah, and you work across the arts, the visual and performing arts. I mean, you've got he really does, folks. He's a connector. He gets and he loves fresh new ideas and that sort of thing. So, kind of to close out, what creative things are bubbling up on your desk or around you there these days? What's kind of the next thing you're gonna?
Wow, what is my next thing? I'm writing a new book.
A new one?
Yeah, about yoga for active adults.
Oh, okay.
But I'm taking a bit of I'm doing some kind of combination of yoga and Feldenkrais, where it's really about exploring, because yoga too can be a closed framework.
Sure.
Do the asana this way or that way, or do this or do that. Yeah. But it's more about exploring. And what I call the 3 keys to it is identification. Know what you're doing already.
Right.
And then differentiation. Do it in a different way with awareness, and then integrate it. So
into your whole life, right?
Into your whole life, exactly. Yeah. So that's part of what I'm working on. And then, there are workshops in Sweden and going to Montreal and watching hockey. And, I have to say, I go watch hockey, I get a lot of creative ideas. to watch athletes at that level,
mm-hmm.
to see their flexibility, to see their vision, to see their skills. Right. Again, one of my favorite quotes from the Gita is, yoga is skillful action.
Right.
And those athletes are skillful, and it's a true inspiration for me. But as far as creativity right now, I spend a lot of time on that book.
Right.
Really working on that. Really, and it's good to write, because then I have to really focus on, get rid of some of the extraneous ideas and really narrow it down. Yeah. Narrow it down so that it still stays open. And that's the hard part, to write it in a non-dogmatic way. So it's great education for me to do it. And then, of course, I get a lot of my creativity from doing movements, whether it's yoga or Feldenkrais or anything else. That's where I get a lot of my kicks from.
Yep, you're the how guy. That's how I introduced you.
Yeah, exactly. How do you
why do you do it?
We don't care about the why. We care about how do you do it.
Exactly.
And I really believe that differentiation is the key here.
Right.
Differentiate how you do it. Do it in a different way, because then the nervous system and the whole organization has to relate differently. You then will have to perceive things differently, and I believe you perceive with your whole body. So by getting out of your habitual way, everything changes. Everything in your life will change, which also is scary. And I think that's one of the reasons why the whole idea of differentiation and getting out of some of your habits, people want it. People want to get out of their habits. But the habit that is safer.
That framework is nice and rigid, and
framework is nice and rigid. It might not benefit you, and it might bring you pain, but at least you know what it is.
Exactly. Well, that's a great way to finish. So thanks so much for your time. And as I said in our show notes, folks, that's at healthcarecreativity.com. You'll be able to find the links to get to Staffan directly. And in the meantime, go ahead and start differentiating a little bit in your healthcare, and we'll see what kind of healthcare creativity we can all bring forward. So thanks very much, Staffan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, take care.